Hi, my name is Linda Bloom and I am the Chair and Founder of the Overcoming MS charity. We are now in our 10th year of empowering the MS community through healthy lifestyle choices, creating a world in which living a full and healthy life with MS is possible. In this special series, 10 Minutes with George, Living Well with MS host Jeff Alex speaks with Professor George Jelinek, founder of the Overcoming MS program. You'll hear about the origins of the evidence-based program, tips on changing your life for life, and about the future of overcoming MS. We really hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the 5th edition of 10 Minutes with George, and welcome back, George Jelinek.
Thanks, Jeff.
So just a few questions today. Firstly, I think this is quite a good question actually, and one that maybe I wish I had an answer with when I started. What do you wish that you'd known earlier on when adopting the program?
Oh, gee, that's a tricky question to answer. I'm not sure that there's any particular thing that would have made it easier. I guess the thing for me really is, in a sense, I wish I'd known the enormity of what change would happen in my life once I started changing. I mean, it's most people sort of feel it's very hard to change, and I think I was probably in that sort of camp prior to getting diagnosed with MS. But in a sense, I wish I could have seen the future and how different life would be when I first started doing this, because I might have made a few different choices along the way. For me, everything about life changed once I started changing apparently simple things like diet, exercise regime, the other parts of the program, but also once I started interacting with the MS community in a sort of more broad way. And I guess had I known some of the enormous changes that were going to happen in my life, I might have been a bit better prepared for them when they came along.
And how would you sum up different impacts of the program as you've seen results across huge ranges of people over the years?
Oh, I think we often, it relates a little bit to what you asked me in the last session, Jeff, but the words recovering and overcoming and so on, we often sort of, people tend to occasionally get a bit focused on those as being the principal and main goals of the program. And some of the best things I've seen have been in people who didn't physically get better. So I mean, I guess a good example is someone who came to the program very early on when I first started running the retreats, who was using a wheelchair and had MS for 25 years and was very disabled and was very depressed, and came with her partner, who was doing everything for her and was finding it clearly very difficult, as is expected. And she went through the program, and each day a sort of the interaction with people and the support she was getting from others, the sort of sense that she might develop some control over this process of inexorable deterioration, you could see that sort of veil starting to lift. And I saw her again at the end of the week. She left looking very different than when she'd arrived, but I saw her again some months and then years later, and she was still using a wheelchair to get around, and she still clearly was very disabled. But for me, there was this sort of radiance coming from her. She had this enormous energy and joy that came out of her, and she was just surrounded by people. at this event that I particularly recall, where everyone just wanted to talk to her and interact with her, and it made me realise that actually her life had improved dramatically without really, in a sense, having overcoming or recovering any physical function. And it started to make me aware of the sort of breadth of outcomes that people can get from adopting this program that aren't necessarily linked to physical recovery. And of course, when you think about the degree of damage that the central nervous system must have suffered for people who have very profound disability after 20 or 30 years, it's probably unrealistic to think that we're going to reverse much of that. But there are other ways in which life can improve significantly, as it did for her. And she was now connected, she was vibrant, she was alive, she was no longer depressed. She said her fatigue had lifted, and I thought, now there's an outcome worth celebrating, even though it doesn't quite fit into some of the preconceived ideas we might have about overcoming or recovering.
I think that's when we came up with the name of the podcast, Living Well with MS. We spent a lot of time and meetings and going back and forth, and that was one of the things I thought, that we've had all sorts of different people with different disability levels, but most of those people are living well. They're having a good life. And so a good life doesn't necessarily mean you're running a 4-minute mile.
No.
You can
live
a good life.
It's great to celebrate the people at that end of the spectrum, of course, but equally there are people like this woman who, really sick in my mind. I've seen many, many such instances now that I'm sort of more attuned to that. And I mean, you're right, it's about living well and about life improving.
And because the program has been going along quite a long time now, is there any additional or even conflicting evidence that's been discovered since you founded the Overcoming MS program that's led to a change in recommendations?
Well, early on we changed recommendations a bit in light with the evidence. I guess people probably who haven't been on the program a long time would be unaware. At the beginning I was eating fat-free dairy, for example. I mean, Swank said fat-free dairy products were fine. It was really in 2000 and 2005 a couple of papers came out from very renowned research institutes that showed the risks and dangers of the protein in dairy, which made me modify the program. And then of course there was fish oil, which we used to recommend either fish oil or flaxseed oil, and our holism work showed no association at all between fish oil consumption and health outcome, whereas it showed a very strong association for flaxseed oil. And the science has evolved around that. So we know now that fish oil that you buy off the shelf at the grocer, basically most of it is oxidised. It doesn't, it may even be harmful, let alone be healthy. Whereas flaxseed oil, we know, is usually very carefully stored and looked after properly, and so you get the direct benefits of the omega-3s without all that oxidation going on. I mean, they're the sort of two obvious ones that spring to mind where we've actually made significant changes to the program, but equally there are things that come along all the time, and I mean that is the nature of a research-based program, that this is based on the best available evidence, and the best available evidence is always changing. There's more coming out all the time, and we're starting to hear more, for instance, about intermittent fasting, and there may come a time when there's enough data to recommend that as part of the program. Again, as a choice, some people won't want to adopt that, others will. There's stuff in the literature now about cryotherapy, about cold, regular exposure to cold, and some people have already adopted that. But again, these things are in their infancy, really, and we aren't at a point where I think it's sensible to adopt it as a mainstream recommendation in the program. But like all evidence-based programs, the evidence keeps accumulating, the program will keep evolving, and that's how it should be.
So, I mean, I think that's a key point you made there about the evidence. So I think there are quite a lot of people who are implementing intermittent fasting and cryotherapy, but the program won't change until there is actually a level of evidence. So, you know, if it's something we think, well, I think that might be helping and actually feel better for that, that's great, but it's not going to go into the program. And it is an evidence-based program. You're not going to change that until there is the evidence to back it up. Is that the case?
Yeah, and it has to pass a certain threshold, really, to be credible enough to warrant changing the program for it.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, final question. It's hard enough to do everything in 10 minutes, but I've been throwing this question to ask you. How would you explain the OMS program to a stranger in 1 minute to get them on board?
Oh, golly, that's a task. Okay, well, it's a program that involves changing a lot of your bad lifestyle habits into good lifestyle habits, so that you modify the risks of deteriorating from this illness. So there's no guarantees, but if you can modify the risks, and there's good science on which factors cause the illness to progress, if you can modify those, then you give yourself every chance of having the best possible outcome. And these are generally diet, exercise, stress, sunlight and vitamin D. They're really the sort of key planks.
Okay, and with that, I think that was about a minute, yeah. Thank you very much for joining us, George Jelinek.
Great, thanks, Jeff.